Welcome to The Feminist Romantic. I'm your host, Cara McKinnon. On this episode, I'll be talking about revising a romance novel. The reason I picked this topic for this week is because I was supposed to be revising the fourth book in my Fave Sky series, Secret Magic, by now. But there have been many setbacks in my writing this year, and I'm still not quite done writing the first draft yet. But I'm going ahead with this podcast anyway. So, let's talk about revision. First things first, let me define my terms. Revision, in this case, is different from editing, and let me explain why. Even though the person who helps me with my revision is my editor, I don't think of this stage as editing. Revision, to me, is about rewriting. It's about the big picture. It's cutting scenes, adding new scenes, moving scenes around. It's also about layering in things I missed in the first draft, like description and detail, emotion, or cutting things I put too much of into the first draft. Also, usually description and detail. I write historical, so I tend to find things in my research, and I really, really want to find ways to get them into the story, and it doesn't always work. And my editor is the first to point out and say, yeah, you didn't need that there, just cut it. It's not adding anything to the story. Except for you to say, oh wow, I found this in my research. So this is revision to me. It's about the big picture. It's about making sure the plot escalates well and at a good pace. It's about character work. It's about setting and world building. Revision, to me, is, quote, editing the story. Editing, on the other hand, is the words. So when I go to edit a book, I look at word choice, such as omitting needless words, changing overused words, removing what's called filtering language. That's when you have a character see things or feel things or hear things when, if you're in their point of view, you can just say that they are happening. You don't have to say, oh, I see the tree. There's just a tree there. Or I hear footsteps. It's just footsteps are happening, you know. So you remove that sort of thing in the editing pass. I also pay attention to sentence structure and paragraph structure in the editing, focusing on rhythm and pace, long and short sentences, long and short words. I'll check for glaring grammar mistakes, although I will happily go for a technically, grammatically incorrect sentence as long as it's clear what I mean. Sometimes, in order to be completely prescriptivist about grammar, you have to do some, like, sentence pretzeling or gymnastics in order to make it work, like the preposition at the end of a sentence thing that is totally not a rule that should be imposed on English, but we somehow imposed it anyway. Yeah, it's really hard to move the preposition to where it would have been in Latin, because English is not a Latin language, it's a German language. Anyway, that's another podcast. Getting back here. So once I'm finished with that editing pass, I do my proofreading pass, where I look for typos, mistakes in dates, names, details, punctuation errors, and other formatting problems. So there's 3 big steps: revision, copy editing, word editing, and proofreading. Any of these steps may be taken a number of times, specifically revision. It's best to get all your big picture rewriting done before you move into the word level, because you just spent, 5 hours looking for typos, but now you're going to have to rewrite a big chunk of the book. You're just going to have to do that step all over again. So it's best to do all of your revision first. I like to do at least 2 revision passes on my books. With my current one, it might only be 1. I'm just so behind, and I really want to get this book out. And my editor's already working with me to revise what I have finished as I'm moving through the book. So hopefully we'll only need 1 revision pass this time. But so that's where I am right now, and that's why I wanted to talk about revision today. This podcast will talk about revision in general, but I will specifically be talking about things that you need to revise for romance versus other kinds of fiction. What does a romance writer want to look at that's the same as everybody else? Well, you're going to want to look at your plot. All fiction has a plot. The exception might be some really out there, like avant-garde art pieces, or like really close character studies where nothing actually happens, but you're just really focused on a character. But that's not what we would call commercial fiction. That's definitely more of like a literary or artistic fiction. So when I say fiction here, just read genre fiction, which is very much interested in plot. Now, plot is also, or should be, tied to characters. So those are the 2 things that are going to be on the top of your to-do list for revision. You want to make sure your plot has conflict, that the conflict escalates, that the stakes increase. You should make sure that all of that stuff is being motivated by characters and their choices, and that what the character wants and the reasons why they can't have it are clearly stated in the work and not just in your head. So there must be obstacles to overcome internally and externally. There need to be characters who want things that are different than your protagonist, whether it's a villain who actively seeks to thwart your character, who probably wants either the same or the opposite thing to your protagonist, or just an antagonist who wants something different and pulls the character away from their goals. All of these characters need to be fleshed out and dynamic. And that's important for revision, because when you go through your first pass, you may not even know who the characters are yet. And a lot of writing your first draft is figuring that out. So in your revision pass, you want to make sure that motivations are on the page and that the characters are consistent. That you don't, what's called, break a character just because you needed them to be doing a certain thing in a certain scene, or, and this is the really egregious thing, because you wanted to make a joke. And so you made them do something that was out of character for the specific need of that scene or that joke, and then either you brought them right back to the person they used to be, or you continued on with that, but that the character that you first established bears no resemblance whatsoever to the character who then goes through the rest of the book. So these are all things that anybody is going to do in revision. You're also going to look at setting and world building. You're going to try to balance out details and descriptions, particularly if you write in a speculative genre like fantasy or science fiction, and to some extent historical fiction as well, as you can get, like I said, for me, I can get excited about my world building and my research, and you want to put a lot of that on the page, but what you really need to stick to are the things that your characters notice and the things your characters care about. So if you tie your description and details into the emotional landscape of your characters, you'll be fine. That's exactly what you need to do in revision. The other extreme can happen too. You can have whole pages of dialogue with no action or description. This is called talking heads, because it's basically like reading a play. All you get is he said this and she said this and he said this and she said this, and you have no idea what they're doing, what they're feeling, where they're sitting and having this conversation. And that's problematic. So for those type of scenes, you will want to add in more action and detail. And that's all very general. No matter what kind of book you're writing, these are the kinds of things you're going to be doing as you sit down to do your revisions. You want to make sure all of that stuff is working, and if there are problems in the story, you're going to fix them. But some specific things that romance needs in revision is, for one, looking at not only the plot arc, but the romance plot arc. Now, if it's just a subplot, it will be its own separate thing. It won't necessarily be tied to the main plot. It may arc and actually finish its arc before you even get to the climax of your main plot. Or if you're writing a series, it may be mid-arc when the book ends and you pick up mid-arc for the next book. So there's lots of possibilities for people who are not actually writing a romance per se, but who have romance in their books. But you still need to think about the arc. You need to think about where you are, or where your characters are rather, in that arc as you move through the story. And you need to understand actually what that arc is. I'll get into that in a little bit. If you're writing a romance, as opposed to a book with a romance in it, your romance arc and your plot arc will be inextricably linked. There may be things that happen a little off to each other, but for the most part, when you're writing a romance, the romance is your story. Even if it's a cross-genre piece, so there's also a mystery happening, or there's also a fantasy story happening, or whatever. But if you are actually writing a romance, then the romance arc and the plot of your book are going to run pretty close to parallel throughout the course of the book. And you want to make sure during revisions that that's true. You don't want to have the romance climax happen 50 pages before the climax of the other story, the bigger plot. Because if that happens, the reader is going to feel weird. Like you just resolve something in your romance, and it's a romance book, so the book should be kind of over now. But yet you're still talking and there's still things happening, and it's going to feel disjointed. And honestly, it's much better for your story if you have everything happen in tandem. And that way, if you hit the climax of your exterior story and the climax of your interior romance at the same time, it'll feel complete and fulfilling for your readers. So one of the ways that you make sure that the romance is arcing properly is by doing good character work. Character work is important no matter what you're writing. But for romance, you need to have your characters be balanced. This is something that probably some people might disagree with me on, because they would say that as long as, your point of view character, for example, if you're in first person, is well arced and you get enough of the other romantic character or more than one, then it's fine. But I come from the place where I want my romances to be balanced. I want to be satisfied that I know all of the characters that are in this relationship, whether it's two characters or more characters, and that they all fit and worked together, that I know why they belong together. And that's true whether it's a first-person narrator or multiple third-person point of view. I want to know all of the characters very well by the end of the book. So for me, I need to pay attention to making sure that I grow and arc and change all of the characters involved in my romance equally, or as close to equally as you can get. And part of that growth and arc is that you're pushing them toward acceptance, or rather embracing love. Specifically, embracing the love that's being offered by the other person or people in the story. So the characters need to end up as functional members of a romantic team. And I don't specifically call out a lot of my ideas as feminist on this podcast, despite the name of the podcast being The Feminist Romantic. But this is one time where I'm going to make some sweeping statements about what I think about romance and how romances should be. And I know not everyone's going to agree with me. So here's the thing. I don't like codependent stories. I don't like the I would die without you trope, except in a couple of very rare sci-fi fantasy settings where that's actually part of the world building, like fated mate kind of deals. Outside of that, it kind of drives me crazy. I prefer my romantic groups to be equal. I like that being together makes them better people, that they want to be together because it makes them happy and they just work as a team. But, and this is important, they could survive on their own. They can live without each other. They just don't want to. So when I'm revising my romances, I like to make sure that I'm arcing my characters toward that specific understanding of themselves as individuals in the world and also as part of this romantic group. That they can exist either way, but that it's just so much better to exist as part of the team, as part of a pair or a moresome. So that's something specific that you have to do in romance, even if you don't subscribe as much as I do to the balance, you still need to have them arcing towards the romance. And that's important no matter what you're doing with your romance. So I would argue that if you have any romance in your book, even if it's not specifically a romance novel, this type of character work is very important. And if you don't do it, your romance is going to feel slapped on, that you just added it because you wanted to say you had a romance in your book. So you've got to do the work, whether you're going to leave them in the middle of their romance arc at the end of the book and pick it up later or not, or if you're going to actually arc them all the way through, you need to do the work. They have to go through the motions of a romance, and it can't just be, I want a romance in here because it's convenient for the story, or really, really awful reasons like I need to motivate my male, usually, character to do something, and therefore I will take away his love interest for either kidnapping or killing, which is just, yeah, don't do that. Don't write a romance just so that you can do something horrible to one of the characters, whether it's a male or a female, in order to motivate the other character. That's the worst. Don't do that. I mean, sometimes those things happen in romance stories, but it's part of the bigger picture, and it's not just the one person's story. So yeah, be careful with that, and try not to do it at all. But if you have to do it, make sure that both sides are important and not just the one. Yeah, don't do it. Anyway, if you have your romance and you're not just throwing it into your book just to have it, your characters should go through this arc, and at the end they need to not just accept love but actively seek it. And this is where the grand gesture comes in, and it exists for a reason. And despite what rom-coms would have us believe, it's not just a way for a stupid guy to atone for his dumbass mistakes, although sometimes it is that as well. But what it really is a choice to embrace love and to offer up love in return. It's a way for characters to open themselves up, to make themselves vulnerable to the other person or people in their relationship. It's taking a risk that they're going to get hurt. But because it's a romance, it pays off, and they end up feeling better than they ever have before. And the grand gesture can't, or in my opinion can't, but in many opinions shouldn't, just come from one side. And this is where rom-coms usually get it wrong, because it's almost always the guy in a rom-com who made the stupid mistake and has to make a grand gesture. And I prefer for both of my characters to make mistakes and to choose fear, and then to have to make grand gestures to each other, because for me, it's important that everyone in the relationship is willing to fight for it, willing to risk and to lose everything. And in my opinion, if you don't do that, if one of the characters never has to work at being in love and just accepts everything and falls easily, then the story is always going to be a little unsatisfying. At least to me, because I feel like that would be an unsatisfying relationship to actually have if I was in it. I want to know that if I'm sacrificing something, my partner is as well, whether I'm usually in the rom-com case, the female in this side of the equation, or the male. So that's something to think about when you're first plotting and drafting a romance. But if you're anything like me, you don't know what that gesture moment is going to be until you get there. Maybe you have an idea of what it's going to be like, but once you've gotten to that point in your story, you know the character so much better than you did when you were trying to plot it out at the beginning. And a lot of things may have changed, or at minimum, you can get way deeper into their psyche than you could have in the plotting stages. And so that grand gesture is going to be more meaningful and maybe very different from what you first imagined, which is where revision comes in, because the grand gesture you were building up to when you started the book may not be the one that you actually end up writing. And so you might have to go back to the beginning and make sure you've properly motivated and foreshadowed the ending. It needs to feel inevitable when you get there, but your reader shouldn't be able to guess it from page 1. And I know that sounds vague and not very helpful, but this is why we have editors, to point out the parts where we're lacking and also the parts where we're giving too much away. To be more specific, though, when I revise my romance arc, I look for the moments where, in the beginning, the characters aren't sure. Then they begin to have hope, and they come together. And then they have doubts, and they fall away. And then they make some bad decisions. And then they realize they're wrong, and then fling themselves back into love. And there's usually some key specific moments, which is what makes up your plot, your romance plot, that are pivotal for that arc. And I look at those specifically and make sure those are right. That their emotions in the moment are clear. That there's always a good reason for their actions and their choices. And that there's always a consequence for those actions and choices. Including, and importantly, including the choice to have sex. Because a lot of times people will throw sex scenes into a book because they want to make it spicier or, more edgy. But if the sex scenes aren't complicating the story and the relationships and the characters, they don't need to be there. And they should be cut. And I know that sounds weird coming from, I'm a sex positive romance author and I do have a lot of sex in my books, but I do my best to make sure that every sex scene that goes into my books reveals something about the characters, changes something about their relationship, complicates the plot, and makes their lives more difficult in some way or another. And if I failed in any of that, please let me know, because I would like to do better next time. So generally speaking, as long as your romance does the big things, doubt, hope, fear, run away, and then open up and embrace love, you're going to be fine. No matter what the scale of the romance is in your book, from a tiny little subplot to the book's actually a romance. And these are all the things that I'm thinking about right now as I'm finishing Secret Magic. So yes, as I mentioned, I'm not done yet. I'm headed into the dark moment. This is the time when characters choose fear over love. But I'm still thinking about the big picture as I move into the final portion of the book, which will include the grand gesture. I already sent the first half of the book to my editor, and in addition to pointing out some of the things that are working well, she also cautioned me about one of my character's motivations, as my male lead has some issues, some changes that I'd made about halfway through when I was writing, and I now need to fix them earlier in the book. And speaking of the beginning of the book, that's the big problem for me for revisions. It is a mess. I mean, first drafts, beginnings are usually a mess because you don't know what you're talking about yet. You don't know the characters. You're not really sure if this is the right place to start the story. So you kind of fiddle around for a while getting your footing. But this is the worst it has ever been for me. I discarded so many beginnings with this story and I've never done that before. I mean, sometimes I will write and then I'll get to the beginning and think, oh yeah, all that stuff I just wrote I didn't really need. Here's really the beginning. That's what I did for Theft of Magic, my second book in my series. I cut a whole bunch out of the beginning and started it where it now starts. But this book, I had no idea where to begin. I wrote and rewrote, and I tried things and I tried other things. And yeah, eventually I got to where I am now. And even now, I'm pretty sure I'm not starting in the right place. So that's a big conversation I need to have with my editor. That's a big fix that I'm going to have to make. But then when I finally do pinpoint where the story needs to start, I need to look at where I am now at the end and make sure that I've foreshadowed things, that I have properly introduced and established in the beginning the things that are going to pay off in the end. So as I said before, I still don't want the reader to guess that I'm foreshadowing something, but I want them to feel when they get to the payoff that it was coming, that it was inevitable. And I probably am not going to be as subtle as I hope to be, and I'm sure there are very astute readers who are going to be able to see all the foreshadowing. When you've read enough of these types of books, and especially when you start to study them as pieces of literature, you start to be able to see things, even very subtle things that authors are doing. And yeah, I won't be able to fool everyone, but I hope that even for people who read a lot of romances, that it'll be good enough. So I love aha moments in fiction when that actually can happen, even now after all my studying. It's wonderful. So I hope that I can sometimes give that moment to readers as well. Also, another thing I'm doing as I'm revising or thinking about revision is about my characters. So not just the plot, but the actual characters. How Percy and Evie, the two characters of Secret Magic, have grown and changed, not only in my mind as I come to understand them as characters, but actually throughout the course of the story. So even though I'm headed into this dark moment right now where they're still too afraid to choose love, they're already well on their way to becoming the people they need to be in order to have a fulfilling relationship together. But I need to make sure that's all on the page and articulated in the narrative and not just in my head. And that is an important thing for any writer, because we can often answer the questions that readers have, but we forget to answer them in the book. Try to answer them in the book. This is where editors and beta readers are very important, because you're writing along and you know the answer, so you don't put it on the page. But you need a reader to say, what was happening in this scene? So that you can go, oh, I forgot to tell you what was happening in that scene. Here's what was happening. Don't neglect the editing stage. I know I already admitted that I'm not going to revise as much for this one as I normally do, but I am working closely with my editor, so I do have other eyes on this book. I'm not neglecting it entirely. I'm just not being as thorough as I should be. So some other non-romance things to talk about how good my editor is. She's pointed out some stuff like I have a terrible tendency to establish a scene with description and details, and then as soon as the characters are in the scene, I drop that entirely. And it's just talking heads for the rest of the scene, or sometimes talking heads with action, but no description whatsoever. So something I'll have to do in revision is layer details into those scenes. Not just external details, but internal as well. The emotions of the characters. It's an ongoing problem that I tend to drop the extra stuff. When a scene is really flowing for me, I'm like I'm just hearing them talk to me in my head, and I'm just transcribing the conversation. And then I have to go back later and say, well, what was it that was motivating them to have this conversation? Because I kind of need to tell the readers that. And from a romance perspective, the emotion is actually extremely important. I mean, it's important no matter what your book is. But for a romance, it's key to a reader than their experience of your book. If they don't feel what your characters are feeling, they're not going to be having a deep connection and won't be falling in love right along with your characters. They're going to feel like you've put them at a distance and they're not connected to the story. So, emotions must be on the page, and that, if you miss it in your first draft, no big deal. Put it in revisions. So it's something that I have to do in revisions, so don't feel bad if you have to do it too. Getting all of this wrapped together, the best resource that I have for plotting and revising romantic fiction is Romancing the Beat by Gwen Hayes. I have mentioned this on my blog before, so if you've read it there over at caramckinnon.com, yeah, I'm going to talk about it a little bit more right now. But when I first started the Fae of Sky series, I knew I wanted to write romances. They were supposed to be romance novellas. The first book is only 60-some thousand words. The last book in the series was 90-some thousand words, and it looks like Secret Magic's probably going to be in the 80s. So, yeah, they're not novellas. But that was my mistake. Novellas aside, I knew I wanted to write romances. But I'd never actually done it before. Even in my MFA program at Seton Hill, I wrote a fantasy story with a romantic subplot. I didn't know what I was doing. And I wrote part of Essential Magic for NaNoWriMo in 2015, and I didn't win. I actually didn't even get to 20,000 words. But the holidays were crazy that year and things happened. And I finished the book after the holidays in 2016. And then I sat down and I read it. And it was like, something's missing here. What is it? I looked at it again and I looked at it again. And I thought, I think the problem here is I've just written historical fantasy with a romantic subplot, just like I wrote a fantasy with a romantic subplot for my MFA thesis. And that's a problem, because I want this to be a romance. So I went looking for books about writing romance, and I found Romancing the Beat, and I have never regretted it since. There are lots of books on how to plot a novel, but even if you're only having a romantic subplot, this book is for you. I kind of want to go back to all of my previous books and look at the romantic subplots and fix them using this book. It's basically a beat sheet where she goes through and explains the beats in some detail. And a lot of plotting books use beat sheets, but hers are specific to the romance. And this book showed me what I was doing wrong in Essential Magic, and not just what I was doing wrong, but how to fix it. So my big problem with Essential Magic's first draft was that I had not properly motivated the romance. I'd motivated the fantasy story, the story of the Appalachian Witch coming to London, finding her family, discovering herself, and that was fine. But what I hadn't done was give my romantic couple a reason to not be together. There were no internal obstacles to Etta and Mal's relationship at all. They had an external obstacle, Mal's mom, but I hadn't thought about what would keep them from being together once Cecily gave her approval. In the first draft, they basically got together immediately and only had to work on getting Cecily on their side, and that was it. And it was very unsatisfying as a romance. I had to sit down and think of what, in their stories, would keep them from wanting to be together. Mal's was easy. I'd already given him the backstory of being complicit in Viola and Ian's magical accident, and all I had to do was push him even farther into guilt and fear of magic in the present. I let him believe that they could have a relationship without magic when they clearly couldn't, and that drove them into a rather dark moment in the story. Etta was a little more difficult. Eventually, I landed on the idea of her parents being so obsessed with each other that they made questionable choices about their lives, choices that ended up holding Etta back from learning magic. And now she finally has a chance to learn magic, to experience the world outside of the Appalachian Mountains, and discover who she is as a person. And she doesn't want to lose that person that she's becoming by falling in love and, as she thinks, subsuming herself into another person. Or she doesn't also want to find that her choices are just as harmful as the ones her parents made because of being in love. So I did make it work. Essential Magic works. But I had to do quite a bit of revision to fix those problems, and I basically needed a second storyline for Etta and Mal that wasn't in the first draft. But that experience taught me a lot about writing a romance and how romances work, and now I use Romancing the Beat to plot all of my stories. It was the first thing I did for Theft of Magic, the second book in the series, and I'm working from one right now for Secret Magic. I'm about to go into the dark moment and enter what Hayes calls phase 4 of the relationship. And it's right after the breakup beat. So, there's always a breakup in a romance, whether it's literal or figurative. Figurative ones, the characters don't actually break up for whatever reason, whether they're married or some other circumstance doesn't allow them to actually break up. But they emotionally break up. They're distant from each other emotionally. And then after that comes the dark moment. And that's where I am right now. I'm just about to do the actual breakup and dark moment. And so I'm thinking about wallowing in misery and then realizing they were fools and turning around and choosing love instead. And I'm hoping I can blast through this section all the way through to the happy ever after. And then I can get started on all the other stuff I talked about in this podcast. If you have any questions about revision, about how it works in general, about how it works for romance structure or characterization, get in touch. You can email me at thefeministromantic@gmail.com or leave a comment on the blog post for this episode at thefeministromantic.com. I'll be back in 2 weeks with a special episode focusing on holiday-themed romances. I'm trying to be inclusive in my definition of holiday, so I'm actively seeking non-Christmas romances. I found a fair number of Hanukkah-themed stories, but I'm still looking for Kwanzaa and Yule or solstice stories, and I'm also open to Diwali, which is already over, but it is a late fall, early winter holiday, so I would love to have something for that included as well. If you know of any stories that fit the bill, even ones that just take place during the holiday and maybe aren't specifically about the holiday, please get in touch and let me know. And I'll also accept movies or TV episodes because I'm getting desperate and I would really like to include something for all of these different holidays. Thanks in advance if you know of any. Really, thank you. And for now, this has been The Feminist Romantic. I'm Cara McKinnon, and thanks for listening.